Let's give the mic to Brother Jazz Hayden first.
All right, good evening, everyone. I've been given the task of laying out the historical perspective. But before I begin the historical perspective, I would like to begin with the present. Presently, there are over 2.5 million human beings in cages in this country, and another 5 billion on leashes, under the control of the criminal justice system. This is in a country that represents 5% of the world's population, and they have 25% of the world's prisoners, more than any other nation, civilization in human history. The question becomes, how did things get this way? How did we arrive at this point? And the historical perspective is always the best route when you're seeking understanding about how things are in the present. So where do we start this historical perspective at? Do we start it with the breakdown of feudalism in Europe? The rise of capitalism, the expansion of European population out around the globe, colonialism, slavery, and then all the negative side effects of slavery, and then the Civil War, and the end of the Civil War, and the Reconstruction period, and then the black codes to replace the slavery of the plantation suddenly becomes private ownership of slaves, suddenly becomes state ownership of slaves. And this happens with the growth and expansion of the prison industrial complex, or what we would call the prison system, or the criminal justice system in this country, which is not a criminal justice system. The system has nothing to do with justice. It's all about process, and social control. And so we follow the historical track from post-slavery to black codes, to lynching, convict leasing, and Jim Crow, which was supposed to be separate but equal. And all of this was state sanctioned. And then we move on up the historical chain, and we reach the 60s, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and we have the civil rights struggle, which was a struggle for equality. And we have the gains of that struggle, which was the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But this struggle ended at the prison walls. It didn't go over, and it left one thing intact, and that was felon disenfranchisement. And so the prison population was expanded exponentially. It went from 300,000 in 1970 to 2.5 million today. So all that resulted in, the results of that was that all the gains made as a result of the struggles of African Americans and people of color in this country up until that point was wiped out. Was wiped out. Why? Because they no longer had the right to vote behind those prison walls. And the whole design of suppressing this population was to keep them powerless and keep them away from the ballot box, keep them under the boot of the elite in this country, the majority. So what we had, we spoke about earlier, was this was all put out in the shape of the war on drugs, the war on crime, which essentially was a war against poor people of color. But the 60s are very critical to our understanding of how we got here today, because we had the civil rights struggle, we had the black power struggle, and we had the anti-war struggles against the war in Vietnam. in the country was up in turmoil and everything, all the brainwashing and the narrative about America was called into question. And it was called into question at a time when America was trying to project its power overseas. And it couldn't project this power and this image of themselves as the fount of democracy and freedom and human rights. It could, there was a contradiction there. The people on the domestic scene were fighting for these very same rights that they claimed that they were out trying to share with the rest of the world. So what they had to do was they had to turn around and they had to suppress the domestic movements, the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the anti-war movement. It suppressed all of them. And part of the way this suppressing took place was with COINTELPRO, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so with that, I think that kind of brings us up to date.
Okay, fantastic. We're going to come back to Brother Jazz Hayden. Let's go to Brother Suhail now.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Jazz. So where I wanted to, kind of maybe pick up on and extend was, I mean, it's obviously a very appropriate place that we're in. I know Dr. King made his speech 46 years ago this month at the Riverside Church, where he broke from the established civil rights kind of movement that had failed to connect kind of the domestic struggles around racism with Vietnam and the anti-imperialist struggles. And King found a profound contradiction in that position that the civil rights establishment had taken. And so he felt that you needed, in order to address the systemic forces of white supremacy that were preventing any kind of a semblance of black equality, you had to implicate U.S. imperialism in that equation. And so King made this connection between race and militarism and economic inequality. And he did it here at the Riverside Church and implored everybody, particularly the civil rights establishment, to think beyond the nation, right? He implored them to think beyond the nation. And he also said that the United States must talk and listen to those who it calls enemy. And many of the people on this panel and many of the people in the audience are those that the United States calls enemy. And if it fails to listen to those that it calls enemy, it does so at its own peril. It does so at its own peril. But King sought to connect domestic racism with U.S. war. And when trying to understand the connections between the war on crime, so-called, and the war on terror, so-called, we're making a similar move. And that's why I find this to be really powerful. How do we make this connection? What happened, as Jazz was talking about, in the immediate aftermath of civil rights and the rise of black power? Was the emergence in the United States from a shift from the welfare state to the warfare state. A full frontal war was declared domestically on black and brown communities under the guise of the war on crime, as many of us all know. But simultaneous to that was the emergence in the United States in the early 70s of the so-called Muslim terrorist. We think that it might have happened after 9/11, or maybe it happened in the 90s after the Cold War when Huntington declared a Clash of Civilizations thesis. But it actually emerges in the 1970s after the Arab-Palestinian War in '67, 72 Olympics, the OPEC wars, the Iran hostage crisis. You see this figure rise. So you have, at the same time in the 1970s, the emergence of two figures that come to shape domestic and foreign policy, the black criminal, so-called, and the Muslim terrorist. These two figures come to shape U.S. statecraft. And so it's important for us to understand that these two figures have always been intimately connected, at least over the last 40 years, when we talk about the rise of mass incarceration and especially the expanding U.S. military and imperial footprint in the so-called Muslim world, that these figures have always existed, or at least for 40 years or so. And so if we have that kind of historical understanding, it's important for us to then understand, a native scholar named Andrea Smith, she writes that it's important for us to understand that America is not at war, the war on crime, the war on terror, right? She writes that America is war. America is war. And if we can understand that fundamental posture that the United States takes, both domestically and globally, then we can begin to recalibrate the politics that we pick up, right, and take on. And for me, it's really important in thinking about this context. You know, I come from Los Angeles. I live in Los Angeles. And if you understand the LAPD, you know that it's essentially the kind of laboratory, if you will, for the rest of the country in terms of how it does policing. The so-called ghetto bird, the helicopter, started out in LA, the battering ram. A whole bunch of, because of the defense industry's presence in Southern California, a whole bunch of experimental, if you will, technologies were used in Los Angeles first. And LA, in many ways, has been the incubator for many of these policies. So if you go all the way back even to 1988, for example, LAPD Chief Daryl Gates put in place the STEP program, Street Terrorism and Enforcement Program. You see in 1988, they're calling so-called gang members, black youth, terrorists. This is happening in 1988, right? So you're already seeing the connections and the links between so-called gang members or criminals and so-called terrorists. That's already there. And I can go on and tell you guys maybe a little bit later about very current things that are happening with the LAPD around Special Order 1 and Special Order 11 that are being used to further criminalize black and brown bodies, but they're using the language of security and terror in order to do that. Right? So you see this collapsing happening. In fact, you all know William Bratton pretty well here, unfortunately. Came over to LA to try and right the ship, supposedly. And soon after 9/11, of course, he went to Congress, met with, in front of Congress, is testifying in front of a committee arguing to make Los Angeles the national hub for the interface between local police and Homeland Security. LAPD was going to be that interface and that hub that was going to do all kinds of programs, mapping, surveillance, a whole host of things that they were going to mobilize. And in his testimony, and soon after, he would implore the committee to focus upon what he called the internal war on terrorism, right? And again, he's talking about the war on so-called gangs or crime. And so what I want to say maybe in my introductory remarks is that this connection between the war on crime and the war on terror is much more seamless than we might immediately think. There's a much more intimate connection already there. Because what's at stake in fomenting these wars? What's at stake in fomenting these wars is what the state deems as the value of white life and white property. And that's what it seeks to protect inherently. So those unruly bodies that threaten that have to then be criminalized or therefore called terrorists, right? Thank you.
My father, Ghassan Al-Ashri, was part of what's deemed to be the most extensive terror funding case in U.S. history. He co-founded the Holy Land Foundation, a humanitarian organization in the late 1980s, and watched it become the largest American Muslim charity. But in December of 2001, President Bush shut down the HLF by executive order. Then in 2004, my father and 4 other men, dubbed the Holy Land Five, were charged with conspiring to provide material support to Palestinian charities linked to designated terrorist groups. What was perplexing for the first jury, which returned no guilty verdicts and deadlocked on most counts in 2007, was that these charities, called Zakah committees, also received funds from our own government agencies, most notably USAID. One juror went as far as questioning the credibility of the prosecution's key witness, an Israeli intelligence officer who testified as an expert under a pseudonym. This was the first time in the American judiciary system that an expert witness was allowed to testify without revealing his real name, which prevented my father from confronting his accuser, which is a constitutional right. This man, who went by the name of Avi, claimed he could smell Hamas. Even so, a second trial in 2008 ended with all guilty verdicts. And in 2009, my father received a sentence of 65 years. And to give you an idea of who my father is, I was going to just read you a little excerpt of his, what he said on sentencing day. And I thought that if you could hear his voice, you could get a good sense of who he is as a human being. He stepped up to the mic and he said, "Nothing in my life was as satisfactory as knowing that I could sign a check. It is the only evidence you have used against me, signing the check. But that was the most enjoyable part of my life, knowing that I could sign a check to assist thousands of Palestinian families who got displaced after their homes were demolished. Nothing was more rewarding to me than providing scholarships to hundreds of Palestinian students who had high average grades despite their circumstance. Nothing was more rewarding to me than being a catalyst and turning zakah into real-life assistance for orphans and needy families." The case would go on to be unsuccessfully appealed at every level until the Supreme Court declined to hear the case in October 2012, ending the possibility of any reversal through the justice system. But the story does not end here, and in due time, this will be known as a shameful moment in our history, like slavery and segregation and Japanese internment, all of which were justified at one point in time, but came to be known as very shameful moments of our history. I really just have maybe 2 more minutes at this point, so I thought that I would end by reading an excerpt. I'm writing a father-daughter memoir, and this was from the first time that we ever visited my father at at an East Texas prison. My family visited Baba for the first time about a week after he entered the medium security prison in Seagoville, Texas. By the time I finally saw him, I felt like I'd finished a marathon. I parked the van and reminded my mother and siblings that our visitation time will end in 2 hours. So we hurried down the long cement pathway, glanced up at the towering barbed wire fence, entered through the glass double doors and filled out several sign-in sheets stating that we did not possess drugs or weapons. And we took off our shoes and placed our clear plastic bags of dollars and coins on the counter, walking through the metal detector in 5-second intervals. And then we stuck out our hands for a guard to stamp with clear ink, when suddenly a heavy gray door slid open. So we walked into the trap, prison lingo for the small area designed for you to place your fists under an ultraviolet light, which we did until the guard behind the glass window nodded and flipped the switch that opened the second door. And finally, we were in the visitation room, which reeked of sweat and wet rags, and after handing the forms to the man sitting at the front, I saw several connected rows of seats, chairs that were not for us, since our only contact with Baba was going to take place behind a plexiglass wall. So we waited for him in a bright lit room while my brothers wandered out to buy chips, chewy candy, and soda from the vending machines, food that's not good for them, high fructose corn syrup infested snacks. Meanwhile, Omar flipped through the pages of a ripped book and assembled a few pieces of a well-worn puzzle. And after 30 minutes of waiting, we heard someone shuffling behind the door at the other side of the glass enclosure. And at last, Baba entered the room, but his hands were still behind his back. His hands were still handcuffed. That is, until Baba squatted with his back against the door, his arms through a slot next to the knob, and allowed a guard to use a special key to detach his arms, causing Baba to rub the pink imprints around his wrists, sigh, and sit down. Thank you.
Thank you, Noor. Okay, so now let's go to segment number 2. And after we try to push our way through these segments, not easy because we have a lot of presenters. We've been joined by 2 of them who I'm going to have take 1 minute to introduce themselves, starting with this handsome young man to my left. Yeah, that's you.
Hello, everybody. First, forgive me for being late. I was actually helping individuals who was recently home from incarceration. My name's Amir. I'm a member of the campaign in the new Jim Crow. I did 2 decades under the Rockefeller drug laws, and I was tortured for over 8 hours for someone, they just wanted me to tell, you know, be a snitch, plain and simple. Just an introduction or a story? Well, there you go, that's it, I'm Amir.
I'm Ramzi Qasim. I teach at the City University of New York School of Law. My students and I represent prisoners at Guantanamo, Bagram, black site survivors, and we also work domestically, locally here in New York City with the CLEAR project on, with a range of communities that are targeted and affected by, so-called counterterrorism policies and practices.
Okay, so this next segment, which is going to focus on preemptive justice, a preemptive justice system in the war on drugs is one that targets people of color at every stage by profiling and false assumptions. Someone mentioned, I think it was Suhail, and we should always keep in mind that after 9/11, there was a CNN reporter who was going around, asking people questions. And they walked up to a young African-American Muslim and said, well, what is it like being Muslim in America now after 9/11? And the young man thought for a moment, and he said, it's like being black twice, he said, okay? So let's hear in this section, we need to try to hear from a couple of people who we haven't heard from, so far. And so I'm going to ask Steve to start us off and to be followed up by Amir and Yusuf Salam. And then let's see if we can squeeze in Fahad and the other Fahad, Ahmed, and Shahina as well. Steve?
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to lay the table a little bit and talk about the segment on justice. What has happened to justice in these various wars? Americans love wars. We love them because they are a deceptively simple way to solve complex international problems. We don't have to talk, we just have to go in and declare an enemy and use our firepower, and we got more firepower than most other people, so we can tend to win them. And so we like that. And so it becomes natural that when we have complex social problems at home, we also tend to declare war on them. And we're talking here today about a whole litany of these domestic wars on various things, drugs and terror and crime and secured borders and so on. And what happens is that when you declare war in a domestic setting, you're essentially picking out an enemy. And that enemy is somebody that is outside the law. In a war, you don't have to give your enemy legal rights. All you have to do is defeat him. And although we think of these domestic wars as an analogy, in fact, that's not what happens. In fact, what happens is that we pick out a group and we say this group is the enemy and they are entitled to either no legal rights or greatly diminished legal rights. One of the things that has happened, typically, is that people will say a particular group, the enemy, that we are targeting here because of drugs or terror or something else, is so much of a danger to us that we have to take action against them before they commit a crime. We have to preempt their danger against us. And this has become known as preemptive prosecution. It is where the government goes in and says, I assume that you are planning something bad against me. I'm making assumptions about you. And so that gives me the right, because you are the enemy, to go in and lock you up before you commit a crime, just on suspicion. And you see this constantly in the war on drugs. You have the stop and frisks. You have the assumptions made at every level of the proceeding, going up and down, that the black person is more dangerous and somehow has to be locked up first. Why is that? Because it's a war, because they are the enemy and we can treat them differently. I come at this from the war on terror. I was a lawyer. I was involved in a case up in Albany, New York, and I saw the war on terror firsthand when I represented an Imam up there and realized at the end of it that the government had convicted a completely innocent man deliberately. And I was astonished. I'd never seen anything quite like this before. And at the end of it, a newspaper reporter asked the prosecutor, who was giving a press conference, and said, do you really think that this man was a terrorist? And the prosecutor was surprised and he said, no, he didn't have any evidence that he was a terrorist, but he had the ideology. In order to preempt anything else, that's why we took him down with a sting. And that became the definition of preemptive prosecution. It was where the government became suspicious of this man because of things he said, because of his ideology, whatever that means. And that justified bringing fake, manufactured, phony charges against him. Some of the ways they do it in the war on terror is to pass laws called material support for terrorism laws. And these laws are supposed to prevent money and guns and food from going to designated terrorist organizations. But in fact, the government stretches this beyond anything that we could imagine as being legitimate. One of the things that they do is they criminalize activities that we think of as legitimate, things like charity and peacemaking and free speech and free association and social hospitality. All of these things have been made criminal simply by the government saying you might use this in some way in the future to engage in a terrorist act, and so we are going to throw you in jail for decades to prevent you from doing it. And I would suggest probably the same mechanism is involved in the war on drugs, in the war on crime, what happens on our border against the Latinos. All of these things are part of this war against the other, the war against the people who are not in the white establishment. Sorry, I'm getting a sign here. So anyway, I just encourage you all that we are in this all together. These are not separate things. The government wants us all to believe that we have separate little beefs and problems with the government. We don't. We are all under the same problem, and we have to work together. And one of the ways we can do that is to tell each other stories, the stories that are here that Noor and Faisal and all the people here on this panel are talking about. They have to become our stories. And each one of us has to say, this is just another example of the problem we're all facing. Thank you.
One of the advantages that we have is on this panel, we have a very important mix of people. We have people who have personal experiences, either because they themselves were incarcerated, or family members, or who were incarcerated, and then we have scholars who are studying the problem, and we have activists. So our next two presenters, we're going to first hear a personal narrative. I guess it'll be the short version. The personal narrative from one young man who was incarcerated, as he said to us, on drug-related charges, and he'll talk about that. That's Amir. And then let's hear from Yusuf Salam, who of course was incarcerated for many years for something that he didn't do, and said from the beginning, I didn't do this, and is in fact the only one of the defendants who from the moment they were arrested until today always maintained, I'm innocent, I didn't do this. By the way, if you didn't see that documentary on the Central Park 5, you should go see it. Let's hear from Amir.
Again, thank y'all for coming out. First question I want to ask everybody is, what saying do you actually believe happens? The first saying is, you are guilty before proven innocent, or you are innocent before proven guilty? The first one or the second one? Because most people are guilty before proven innocent, especially if you look like me or have kufis on and you're not of this ruling class. Not only that, I'm glad he said he was in Albany. In Albany is where I was arrested. I was actually getting ready to go to school. And 2 weeks before I went to school, I was picked up and, like I said, tortured for 8 hours. The problem with that was, after I was tortured in there and I still maintained my innocence, when you're inside this institution being Muslim, it's a torture also. By the police, everybody else, they know you might not eat certain foods, and they make sure they give you the other type of foods that you can't eat. Then you'll be placed in solitary confinement for whatever they want. This goes a little bit further for me, because after I continued to maintain my innocence, when I finally went to the parole board, I had a stack of papers from a lot of recommendations from people. Even the judge was like, yeah, this is a travesty and everything else. So when I went to the parole board and I was like, listen, I could tell you everything, but I can't give you remorse for this crime because I couldn't do it. And I thought it was going to be an argument. The parole board was like, we know. And I, what do you mean you know? They said, well, the paperwork says you didn't do it. I mean, wait a minute. What do you mean, what paperwork? Can I have that? He said, well, you know we can't give this to you. And I was so shocked that I just literally just got up and walked out. Because I was like, wait a minute, this is one part of government, knowing next part of government is all in New York State, and you're gonna tell me you know? That's just the beginning. When I came home, they started doing the Hercules teams. And I was running around trying to get jobs. And somehow I said, I know I'm going to be the guy to get chosen. Oh, the Hercules teams is, you got these officers full armor gear as they in war. Well, they are in war. And they patrol the subway stream with M16s, dogs, full bulletproof vests and everything. When I walked down the stairs at 14th Street, I was like, I know they're gonna get me. I have a suit, tie on, but I have one identifying piece of clothing, and this is my kufi. And again, hey, you mind stepping over here? I stepped over, I gave him my bag. Now, they have this little machine that looks like a little video game where they take this piece of paper and they wipe your bags or your clothes to see if there's any type of explosives on it. So they wiped my bag, put it in the machine, and it went off. Beep! Boop. They all ran and grabbed me. They was like, yo, where you coming from? I told them where I'm coming from. They said, where you work at? I was like, I'm a full-time student. He was like, you don't work? I said, no, I'm a full-time student. Then he was like, well, what kind of chemicals you got in your house? I'm like, the same chemicals you probably got. Raid, Ajax, and everything else. What you better do is wipe that thing down. Luckily, I was able to stay calm, and I was really upset. What actually happened, one of the sergeants talked to the officer again. He went back and pulled out a clean cloth and wiped it, and it was clean. Oh, sir, we're sorry. Sorry. But it even goes further. Just this Monday, I'm in Lehman College, and I'm a tutor over there with a lot of people. So I'm tutoring this girl. I'm talking to her because she has some personal problems, and we're sitting there in the car, and I told her, yo, put your seatbelt on. She puts her seatbelt on. We go to the next block. All of a sudden, this white van just comes, cuts us off. Guys jump out with a gun, pointing right at my face. And I'm like, whoa, what's going on? I have a cell phone in my hand. So the cop says, hey, wait, stop. It's a cell phone. It's a cell phone. He yells it 3 times to his partner. And I'm not gonna lie, I was real shook on this one. So I'm like, we got music in the car, and I hear this guy saying it's a cell phone, but the other cop's still coming with his gun drawn. I'm like, wow, okay, this is from the bombing and everything else, but it's always ironic how the same type of individuals is always being chosen for whatever crime it is. With preemptive justice, there's two partners that they have, really several, but the main one of this preemptive justice is the media and labels. The media puts something out there and people just run with it automatically. Well, where you heard that? Channel 2. Well, where you heard that? Channel 3. No matter if it's correct, no matter if they did any investigations, people believe once the media happens, then that's it. So, so in preemptive justice, it's so much with this war on terror, and the real thing is, if the United States and our elected officials actually put policies out there that's humane, policies out there that help everybody. The war on drugs to today spent over $1 trillion. I could just imagine how the war on terror with all these drones and everything else, we have to be into $6–7 trillion. When this money could actually feed everybody in the United States, it could give everybody housing and everybody education. You would rather spend $55,000 incarcerate somebody instead of spending $6,000 educating somebody. What is our responsibility? Everybody here, what is your responsibility? Are you going to just continue to come to events like this? Or, as Brother Amir said, are you going to get involved and get organized?
Let's hear from Yusuf Salam.
You know, as I'm sitting here, I'm thinking about, I used to be that person that was very confused. I didn't understand why I was caught into a system, into a web. And then I realized that that web was prepared for me. You know, back in 1989, there was a woman that was jogging in Central Park. And because she was raped, the city, in their rush to judgment, rounded up most of the young people in the surrounding areas. I happen to live in Schaumburg Plaza, which is directly across the street on 110th Street and 5th Avenue. And the night before, a few guys had gotten locked up from the building, and then they came back and they started rounding up everyone else. And as you can imagine, and you know, it's a funny story that I have to tell you. And it's not really funny, it's actually sad. But as a young person, young people go through life until they become an adult, thinking that they are adults. They think they have all the answers. And so here I was, 15 years old, hearing that the police officers were looking for me. And I said, you know, I'm gonna just go to the cops and tell them that I didn't do anything wrong. And they're gonna believe me because I didn't do anything wrong, you know. Sorry about that. But if you see the film, you also witness one of the only guys that I really knew, that I actually hung out with, that I was friends with, Corey Wise. When the officers came to my apartment building, and my name had gotten placed on this sheet of paper of people that they were looking for. So they asked me who was I, and I said, I'm Yusuf Salam. So they looked at the paper and said, yep, this is one of the guys we were looking for. Crossed my name off the list. And they asked Corey who he was. He said, I'm Corey Wise. And they said, your name isn't on the list, but would you like to come downtown with your buddy? You'll be right back. Corey came home 13 years later. They wrapped us into the web that was prepared for us. And when I say prepared for us, it wasn't until I started really, really understanding this for what it was, from the context of things like statistics. So they have the statistics that state, if you're a person of color, you're gonna be dead or in jail before you reach the age of 21. And then you try to figure out, well, where are these numbers coming from? Who is making these statistics up? And I had a really interesting conversation with Ken Burns. And I say interesting because Ken Burns, we were talking about something, and I said, you know, I'm the guy who believes in conspiracies, you know.
Who is Ken Burns?
Ken Burns is America's #1 documentarian, you know, and he made the he and along with his daughter and Dave McMahon made the film, The Central Park Five. And so we were talking, and I said, you know, I'm the guy who believes conspiracies. I said, there's a conspiracy, there's a book out, Conspiracy to Destroy the Black Boys. And there's also a book out called The Conspiracy to Destroy the Black Girls as well. And he says to me, he says, there is no conspiracy. And I had to pause, because up until that point, I said, you know, me and Ken was rocking, we was talking, and I was like, wait, hold up, he threw me for a loop. And he said, you have to understand, people plan things to be the way they are. And that floored me. It floored me because it also made me understand from a different perspective what happens in the black community. When you have people who have been told that they aren't worth anything, they aren't pretty, they'll never amount to anything, those folks begin to have this downward spiral effect where they become their own self-fulfilling prophecy, you know. And it's really, really hard to get out of that, because then you have we who the war on terror, we who the war on drugs, and we who most of these wild things happen to, you know. But, you know, as my good friend and brother Amir was talking about the media, I couldn't help but think about, let's call him DT. I'll call him DT. DT, in 1989, took out some full-page ads in New York City's newspaper calling for the reinstatement of the death penalty, specifically for my case. You know, and if you think about what was going on back then, there was another report that was written, you know, by the way, we're still known as feral beasts by people like Ann Coulter, you know. But there was another report written by Pat Buchanan that said something to the effect, if we took the eldest one, who was Corey Wise at the time, who wasn't on a sheet of paper, who just was asked, hey, you want to come downtown with your buddy, 16 years old. They said if we took the eldest one and we hung him from a tree in Central Park, and we took the others and we horsewhipped them, maybe the city's park would be safe again. See, what you have to understand is the way the media spins things is that we were convicted in the media prior to even going to trial. And the fact that they could say, maybe the city's park would be safe again, it also lends its arm to the fact that we want to instill fear in the community that you really aren't safe. This might take care of the problem, but you really aren't safe. But you think about this and you say to yourself, had this been the 1940s, we would have been drug out of our houses, hung from trees in Central Park, castrated, and probably burned, and that would have been that. And I would have been talking to you today from the books of history, as opposed to a person having survived, you know. There's so much I can say about this, but I'm gonna wrap up for now, you know.
Good, thank you, Yusuf. By the way, let me say this for the benefit of the younger members of the audience. If you want to be able to get a good cross-referenced understanding on the Central Park 5 case, then I suggest, if you have not done so, I suggest that you go look up, you can even Google it now, the Scottsboro Boys, and read that case carefully. The Scottsboro Boys. Case decades before this one, same basic premise. I think it was just a few days ago, I read in the paper that there's a move now to have the Scottsboro Boys, who are innocent, exonerated. I always say to myself, how do you exonerate somebody who's innocent? But, you know, to have them exonerated on the record. Now, while we're doing personal narratives, we want to wrap up this segment. I'm going to try to tie all of this together by going to Brother Fahad, who Fahad Ahmed, who is an attorney, and also to Sister Shahina, who will be able to give us a different spin on this same subject of people being profiled and set up based on their ethnicity or their beliefs, etc.
Assalamu alaikum. अमेरिका में बसने वाली तमाम कम्युनिटी के साथ अलग अलग तरीके से जो भी तशद्दुद किया है मगर मकसद एक है.
The multiple different communities and their histories that we see in the United States, they get targeted and exploited in different ways, but the purpose behind it is usually the same.
बाहर की जंगों के साथ साथ जो जंगें मुसल्लत की गई हैं उनके साथ साथ यहाँ के शहरियों पर जो जंगें हो रही हैं उनमें अनडॉक्यूमेंटेड लोग, गरीब लोग और तमाम कम्युनिटी के लोगों पर इन्होंने किया है.
And so in addition to the wars that we see abroad, there have been a consistent histories of wars at home, whether it is on marginalized communities, undocumented immigrants, poor people, or many other communities.
NYPD ने FBI और CIA के साथ मिलकर मुस्लिम कम्युनिटी में खुफिया ऑपरेशन तो किए मगर मुस्लिम कम्युनिटी में हर जगह उन्होंने अपने पेड इन्फॉर्मेंट और अंडरकवर फैलाएं जो हमारे नौजवान मुसलमानों को झूठे केसों में फंसाकर जेलों में डाल रहे हैं और लंबी लंबी सजाएं दे रहे हैं.
So at this point, we have sometimes a collaboration, sometimes a competition between the FBI, the CIA, and the NYPD to surveil the Muslim communities across this city and across the country. And not only do they send undercovers in, but they actually recruit people from within the community, pay them as informants to go into the community, build relationships, and entrap people into terrorism cases manufactured by these very informants and by the agencies.
NYPD ने ऐसे बच्चों को भी नहीं छोड़ा जो दिमागी लिहाज से नासमझ हैं, सीधे साधे खेलने कूदने वाले और जिनका IQ लो है या दिमागी लिहाज से unstable हैं.
And they in particular like to target people that are very easily manipulable. People that have mental health problems, people that have substance abuse problems, people that may have a lower IQ or ability to understand things, people that are vulnerable targets.
ऐसे ही मेरे बेटे शाहवार मतीन को NYPD के पेड एजेंट और अंडरकवर ने फंसाया. सबसे पहले मस्जिद में इमाम के लिए और दूसरे मुसलमान लोगों के लिए इन्होंने काम किया. जब वहाँ काम नहीं बना तो मेरे बेटे के पीछे आए.
And so the informant in my son's case first went and approached the Imam of the masjid, of the mosque, when wasn't able to do anything there, went after some other people, wasn't able to get a hold of anybody, nobody trusted him, and so he came to my son, who was very easily vulnerable.
इस पेड इन्फॉर्मेंट और अंडरकवर ने 2.5 साल मेरे बेटे पे काम किया और इस काम के लिए $100,000 दिए गए.
An undercover officer and an informant worked on my son's case, worked on my son for 2.5 years. And for this, the undercover informant received $100,000 worth of pay. His time was actually about a year and a half, so that's a pretty good salary if you work it up.
ना सिर्फ मेरे बेटे को जो जुर्म इसने किया ही नहीं इतनी लंबी सज़ा दे दी 30 साल की, बल्कि पूरी फैमिली को सज़ा वाले दिन जेल में डाल दिया, इमिग्रेशन की एलिज़ाबेथ जेल में.
And through this relationship, he entrapped him, gained his trust, was able to entrap him into a case for which my son was sentenced to 30 years in prison. And not only my son, the very same night that my son was sentenced, immigration raided our home, arrested me, my husband, and my daughter, and hauled us off to immigration jail and locked us away.
और मेरे बेटे को टेराहुट इंडियाना में CMO में डाल दिया, जो अभी ओटिसविल न्यूयॉर्क में आया है. मीडियम सिक्योरिटी में।
Once my son was sentenced, he was put into a communications management unit in Indiana, and he was there for several years, and he will probably talk a little bit more about that. And then he recently got moved to Otisville, New York, upstate.
तो मैं आपको सिर्फ ये बताऊंगी कि मुल्क की सिक्योरिटी के नाम पर ये पेड इन्फॉर्मेंट जो हमारे मुस्लिम नौजवानों को हॉरिबल चीज़ें दिखाकर उन पर प्रेशर डालकर उनको इस तरह से फंसाते हैं और इस तरह का इल्ज़ाम लगाते हैं जैसे कि ये मुजरिम है, हालांकि ये बेगुनाह है।
And so I'd like to close by just sort of pointing out to you that these informants and these undercovers develop relationships of trust with young, impressionable people. Once they have their trust, they incite them and inflame them into inflammatory conversations, and then they turn around and blame them for having those conversations and ideas.
न सिर्फ बार उन्होंने इस तरह से दिखा के बच्चों को फंसाते हैं, बल्कि जेल के अंदर भी FBI और इनके दूसरे लोग इसी तरह इनके पीछे पड़े रहते हैं.
And not only on the outside, but even the ones that are serving time on the inside are constantly being approached by informants who are trying to entrap them again.
Fahad, would you take another minute or two just to add to that?
So, I'm an organizer. For me, it's really about how do we start to fight back against this. And one of the issues that we have is we have to look at things horizontally and vertically. Horizontally, how do we link across communities? What's the commonality between Shahina's story and the mother of Kimani Gray? What is the commonality between a kid that gets stopped and frisked and a mosque that has to kick somebody out for engaging in these inflammatory conversations, only later discovered that it was an undercover officer? We have to kind of see that different communities, even though what may appear to be different, the motive behind it, I like the term, the presumption of guilty until proven innocent is what's motivating for all of our communities. But then we also have to see it vertically within our communities. Oftentimes we pay a lot of attention either to the very extreme cases of people being killed, of people being locked away for many years, or we pay attention only to the very small day-to-day humiliations, whether it's stop and frisk, whether it's passive surveillance, and the routine harassment. We have to see these as a spectrum. And only when we start to do that, both vertically and horizontally, are we able to bring people together to have conversations to sort of figure out what are ways that we can get organized, build our power, try to change policies. And changing policies, we're engaged in a lot of struggles, a lot of the folks on here. Changing policies is not the end goal. That's just the training ground to build movements which can start to change the society and the system as a whole. Because it's not just about some bad policies. The system is rotten to the core, and we have to change the system.
So, Brother Omar, I'm going to pass the mic to you and ask you to comment on prison conditions. And then we're going to hear from Brother Ramzi Qasim, attorney Ramzi Qasim, who is an attorney working with Guantanamo prisoners as well.
Thank you, Imam. Once again, my name is Five Omar Mualim Ak. I want to briefly say that I'm blessed to have a very enlightened father, and actually the Imam knows my father for a very long time. So I went into the incarcerated prison industrial system very enlightened, very, in some sense, rebellious. But I just wanted to say also that this is not about different communities under attack. This is about people under attack, a caste system under attack. Because in our community as a whole, we've been under attack. From days of Operation COINTELPRO, which is one of the operations that was exposed, to use the term domestic terrorism as a threat to urban communities in some sense, where Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Sutton was all infiltrated, the same conditions, and these same things are going on today, where they have informants infiltrating institutions and assassinating members and exposing somewhat is what they call domestic terrorist attacks. These domestic terrorist attacks have been charities, have been the free lunch program, has been Saturday schools, in which they call educational attacks, Recently, in 2007, they indicted a whole bunch of brothers from the Black Liberation Army, which included, quote unquote, domestic terrorism attacks by recruiting community youth members into entrepreneurship programs. So speaking about the internal side of incarceration, you have to understand that this is a complex of slavery. The 13th Amendment states that slavery is only amended only if you are not committed of a crime, and that induces slave wages and labor. But that is not only the mentality. This is an institution that has been doing this since slavery. There's more people actually incarcerated today than it was in slavery in 1850. You have to understand that, as my elder, Brother Jazz has stated, that 2.5 million people are incarcerated in America. 80% of that is Black and Latinos. You have to understand that, you know, even the conditions of solitary confinement, which is torture, one of the worst solitary confinements that I've been in myself is Orleans before I faced deportation, which is a deportation box, because as soon as you deemed to be from another country in some sense, oh, you're going to solitary, which is what they call residential separation, but it's actually solitary confinement and torture. So these conditions of incarceration, mass incarceration, begins with a pipeline from the community. And this pipeline comes from stop and frisk, huddling of a poor community in some sense. And that incorporates the treatment of how our people are regulated, huddled into small circles into what they call the ghetto communities in some sense, or a poor neighborhood. So it's not, and this is happening not in just in New York or a Black and brown community, this is happening in the caste system of poor. And this stature has been going on since the 30s, since the 20s, since even with, you know, different race caste systems, as in the Chinese when they built the railroads. And during that time, they couldn't just be eliminated, so they had to have viable cause to incarcerate them, and then after incarceration, just straight exterminate them. So the prison system is an industrial complex because you work, and you have to understand that America is addicted to incarceration in some sense. These towns, even in New York State to speak on from personal experience, thrive off the financial means of this jail. This jail supports that town. The CO, the guards, their institutions that work from there, the programs, even the maintenance companies that run inside the jail, they get paid from the facilities, they get paid off the workers, and all this is from the taxpayers back, from health insurance, of course, that's paid for by the taxpayers. But that's why we call it the prison industrial contract, because it benefits the town. So America has become addicted to incarceration. America has become dependent on the system of society in our communities to huddle in that mass incarceration, to feed that, because it's a profit-bearing. Yes.
Thank you all for being here tonight, and for the organizers for pulling this together. I'd like to draw your attention to the mural over there that reads "Victims of Preemptive Prosecution." The last time I saw that mural was about 2 years ago, and I can tell you that in that time, it has grown. And for each one of those placards, there are family members like Shahina, like Noor, like Faisal, who stepped away. And for each one of those placards, there is a questionable, I'll just put it mildly, there is a questionable prosecution, like what you've heard about from Brother Amir here and Brother Yusuf here. And then when I look up at the title, Victims of Preemptive Prosecution, I have to question that. I specifically questioned the word preemptive, right? That assumes that there was something to prevent, something to preempt. And I feel like we're almost being too generous here by calling it preemptive prosecution. Because when you think about stop and frisk, and when you think about NYPD surveillance, when you listen to what the police is saying about those policies and practices, they call them preemptive, right? Because the idea is, if you intercept so-called precursor conduct, you can nip it in the bud. If you get to those dangerous Blacks and Latinos and Muslims, right, ahead of time, you can forestall, you know, the more dangerous actions that they are assumed to be about to take. And so I've always thought that the term is really too generous, and it's a concession. Because the way that I have come to see those cases, as well as policies like stop and frisk and the NYPD's secret surveillance program, I've come to see them as predatory, not preemptive. Those are predatory prosecutions. That's predatory policing. It's preying on people. And of course, maybe to your average observer, looking at stop and frisk side by side with surveillance, the average person might think, well, these are two very different beasts. But I beg to differ. I mean, perhaps stop and frisk is overt, right? It happens on our streets. We see it. We experience it. It's in the open. If you walk in certain neighborhoods, you are going to see young people getting stopped and frisked, whereas surveillance is by its nature covert. But in my view, that's the main difference, and the differences end there. Other than that, it's the exact same genealogy. It's the supposedly preventative policing that's really just based on crude racial and religious profiling. And you have to keep in mind that it might make sense to you for the police department to engage in stop and frisk and to engage in surveillance. That might make sense to you unless you're on the receiving end of those policies. If you're at a remove and you're just hearing the police tell it, you may well believe them. But if you're in those communities, if you're seeing what's happening there, it makes no sense. The costs are borne by innocent individuals, and that brings me to, I'd like to make a connection between what's happening here and what's happening there. My students and I represent prisoners at Guantanamo, and as many of you have probably heard, all of the prisoners at Guantanamo are on hunger strike right now to protest not just the conditions of their confinement, but the facts of their confinement. And what's been really disappointing to me is that in the way that hunger strike at Guantanamo has been presented, not just from the military itself or the White House, but also from people who are our allies, it's been presented as an act of despair. And I disagree with that, not just from my own opinion, but having spoken to my clients. One of my clients actually, and these words stuck with me, he described it, and I'm not exaggerating here, he described it as the best of times. It is the best of times. These are people who have been on hunger strike since February. They are being beaten and tortured daily, and he described it as the best of times because they're asserting their agency. It's a life-affirming act. They're saying no to that ongoing, never-ending injustice. And what I like the most about that action that's going on at Guantanamo now is that it didn't start in the solitary confinement blocks. It didn't start in the harshest part of that prison. It started in Camp 6. Camp 6 is the facility that the US government had been holding out as a model communal facility where the prisoners had privileges. The idea was, we've pacified them. They've accepted their condition. And that's where the hunger strike began. And to me, that makes me think about our situation here. We're all sitting in a position of relative privilege and luxury and freedom. And I think it would be particularly fitting for a movement that pushes back against all of these policies that we're talking about today, the predatory prosecutions that you see up there, predatory policing that you see on our streets, be it stop and frisk or surveillance. It would be fitting for a movement that pushes back against all of that to begin from where we are, a position of relative privilege. Thank you.
Okay, there's an old Arabic language proverb that says, time is like a sword. Okay, I got it. If you don't cut it, it will cut you. So we don't want to get cut in here. But Andy's here. So Andy,
if we're
I'm
short on
going
time,
to give you
you could close out if we're short.
No, I'm going to give you the awesome responsibility of making a succinct statement that's going to wrap things up for us.
Just as a reminder, we have the space until 9, so it doesn't have to be...
Oh, we do? Okay. Well, in that case, Andy, take a couple of moments. And then, we don't want to cut out, then we're going to open it up. And let's try to have some good, incisive questions that I know are just bubbling on the top of your brains. So, Andy, introduce yourself will you please, and then say a couple of words.
Well, my name is Andy Stepanian. I myself was at the CMU for 6.5 months, the CMU at Marion, Illinois. But I think what we need to take away from events like this, and there's lots of events where people come and speak and talk about horrible stories happening, is that we need to brainstorm and talk about how we're going to challenge these narratives that enemize people, that turn human beings into enemies, that turn people that allegedly sling crack into commodities that are put into a prison industrial complex to churn out products in prisons. We need to stop demonizing people because of their religious affiliations or lack thereof, and we need to start becoming a community again. And the only people that are going to be able to do it are not politicians, they're not police officers, they're people in rooms like these. It's not left, it's not right, it's right wrong. And so I'd like to lean more towards opening it up for discussion and questions, because frankly, I'm humbled by the people that are in this room and what they've gone through or who they're representing. There's a lot of suffering in this room, but there's also a lot that I find inspiring, because as these people walk through the fire, seeing their resilience, especially Mrs. Parveen over here, I'm exceptionally inspired by her resilience. I remember the other day we were in a meeting and you were talking about, if I could say this, on Mother's Day, you want to get the mothers of incarcerated men involved with this preemptive prosecution together, and you want to go out there with boxing gloves and stand in front of town hall. And she put her fists up like this, and I was moved, because it's someone refusing to be broken. And these people are the people that create bookmarks in history. You know, Yusuf, you're someone who's going to be creating a bookmark in history. It's a sad chapter, but at the end of that chapter, hopefully it's going to be part of a beautiful story. I want to see the same thing for Noor. I want to see the same thing for Yasin Aref. And I think that's what we're all here for. We're all here for the men at Guantanamo Bay. So I think if we could do one thing before we open it up for questioning, I think maybe we could cheer for the men that are hunger striking right now at Guantanamo Bay. I'm thankful that they're doing it. If people have specific questions related to the Communications Management Unit, I can stay outside all night and answer them, but I want to yield my time to these folks and you guys having a really powerful conversation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. So, you know, speaking as one of several people who are in the room for whom fasting is part of our way of life, I would encourage you not just to cheer, but skip a meal. Skip a meal and think about the people who are in Guantanamo Bay, who are hunger striking voluntarily. And it might give you an even deeper sense of empathy with them. So let's do a few things, okay? Right now we want to open up the floor. It would help if there was a mic in that mic stand. But if you will raise your hand, I can see pretty well from up here, and let's try to, we've spent all of our time so far concentrating on the many facets of this problem. And I really want to, let's give a hand for Brother Hani and the other people working with him who helped to conceive how we go about this. And I say that because, see, I'm one of the people who works on bridge building in this city, and I'm just going to tell you frankly that too many instances, as Suhail pointed out, where this is a problem affecting people in different ethnic communities and from different backgrounds. But I'm going to tell you that people don't know each other, okay? Those of us who are African Americans know very little about what's going on in Southern Asian and Arab communities and vice versa. That's why it's important for us to have a gathering like this, in a space like this, because we need to hear different angles of the problem. We need to hear the problem as experienced by Jazz and Amir, and along with what's going on in Guantanamo and what's going on in these federal prisons. And that way, what's happening here becomes something that we can all benefit from and leave out of here focusing on some solution. So please, let's ask your questions, and in the responses that are coming from the panel, I'm going to ask the panel to try to take the question and focus in on a solution to the problem and not just the problem itself. So I saw the first hand right here. Yes, ma'am. If you'll go to the mic, please, right there in the middle. Matter of fact, we'll be able to save a couple of moments. No, right there. There's your mic. I'm going to keep mine. That way I can control what's going on here. All right. Yes, ma'am. Go right ahead.
My name is Bernice McCann. I'm with Occupy Catholics. And I just want to say that recently I wrote an article for America Magazine on mass incarceration, which, in my opinion, is a crime against humanity. And I know the history well. I've taken a lot of time over the last 6 months working and roving around the city at different groups, interfacing with different groups throughout the city, like Stop Mass Incarceration, whether I've been on a street corner, soapboxing, or in a meeting with Vocal for the press. I've gotten around. No one is together. My frustration is this. We can't continue to have these meetings and be so disparate from one another. There has got to be a central focus. There's got to be a core group that starts. I'm asking you to please do that. I'm willing to interface with, I have an appointment with Reverend Jackson. I have an appointment with Al Sharpton. It's time we pick up Martin Luther King's call once again and hit the streets.
Thank you.
And we can't do that unless we're organized.
Okay, so the question becomes, and let's have the panel respond. So the question becomes, how do we eliminate some of this disparity and distance? And let's go to Jazz.
I forgot to mention when I spoke earlier that I am one of the founding members of the campaign to end the new Jim Crow. And the question, the issue that was just placed on the floor is central to the work that we're trying to do, right? We're trying to connect the dots. As Fard had said earlier, we need horizontal and vertical integration. Horizontal and vertical integration. That means if we got 10 people working on drug programs, they need to be talking to one another. If we got 10 people working on 10 groups working on mass incarceration, they need to be talking to one another. And if we're all working for the same populations, whether they be Muslims, African Americans, Latinos, if we are working, all of us are working for that same population, advocating for that same population and trying to organize that same population, we need to be talking to one another. That's horizontal integration. And then we need vertical integration. We need to be talking to academia and all those PhD work that is produced and then put on the shelf. We need them to start interpreting that, translating that into a language that people on the ground can understand, right? We need a total coming together. And my friend Joe Kay is in the house, and I always like to acknowledge him for giving me this phrase. We have to end boutique activism. Boutique activism. That's what we've been engaged in for the last 40 years, man. Boutique activism. Everybody takes a piece of the problem, and then they just close their eyes to everything else, right? And so what we've had is people working to essentially validate the system. They validate the system when all they are out there doing is tweaking the system. Oh, we need to fix this here. Or we need to adjust this here. We need some legislation, man, that will fix this up here. but they never talk about abolition. They never talk about getting rid of this system. This system is broken on all sides, as the movie says, man. Yeah, I mean, we can't fix it. Abolition is the only answer to this. And the same strategies that they're using on Muslims, they perfected them in the streets of Harlem. They perfected them in the streets of Harlem, man. Those manufactured conspiracies, man, I have been a victim of it. You know, so there's nothing new. There's no separation between Muslims, man, and poor people of color, man. There's no separation. We are natural allies. We are natural allies, man, because if we don't come together, we will continue to remain at the mercy of the greedy who are organized against the needy. And we will always be at the mercy of the regulators, and we will always be the regulated until we come together and speak in one voice.
So now during these panel responses, I'm going to ask, I hadn't been doing this, but I'm going to ask the members of the panel to stand for their response. That way it'll be a little easier, you know, for those of you in the back to see. So now let's hear from Fahad Ahmed.
Just very briefly, you know, one of the things is that there are a lot of efforts that haven't taken place on the ground. In New York City, you know, there's been a campaign against the NYPD, bringing together folks that have been working on surveillance issues with folks that have been working on stop and frisk issues. Many of the folks here have been part of that effort. I think sometimes we do a disservice to ourselves if we expect that we're going to all come together with a master plan, all on one page, and then move forward. You have to start with baby steps. And you know, some of that's taking place in New York. They are reform struggles, as I pointed out earlier and as Brother Jas pointed out, but that's a training ground. How do we start to work together? How do we start to have small wins so that we build a momentum to bring about larger change? The second, I think, important part of this is that one thing we have to keep in mind, while I agree with the idea of doing vertical and horizontal integration, we have to put the people that are directly affected at the front. They have to be leading the struggle. For as long as we create hierarchies within our own movement and say that these people are criminal, let's not talk about them first. These people are terrorists, let's not talk about them first. As long as we create hierarchies, we will not move forward. In order to build a movement, we have to overturn our hierarchies that have been created by society, and we can't create our own hierarchies either. Thank you.
I agree with solutions. I'm a student of history, jazz, and all my bigger brothers. So what I do is, it's up to us. Everybody in here has influence over 5 people: mother, father, sister, brother, friends, a factor 5. Now, with hands, because we need to build community. How many of y'all know your neighbors on the left and right side of you? And how many of y'all talk to your neighbors? By raise your hands. That's the problem. Only 6 of y'all raised your hand. So how do you expect something to happen if you don't know your neighbor next to you? Because if something happens to them, you're like, oh, that's not me. And they're saying the same thing. I can guarantee if you go to your neighbor and say, listen, I just want to introduce myself because we need to build community. We need to protect each other because we're right here. That person might be like, wow, I wanted to think of that too. So now I'm putting it back on y'all. Go talk to your neighbor. You know, bingo here. That's right. We can organize right here because if we had that factor 5 of everybody right here, we can have at least 500 people at the next event. But I'd rather have us in the courts. You know, we have a brother tomorrow who needs help in the courts. Only 2 people showed for him, and he's been out there on the front line. We have to do this together. And this is the second time that I was at an event, and I asked the audience, how many of y'all talk to your neighbor? And no one does that. So what are we doing? You know, there's that one saying that says, silence is consent. Silence is consent. So if you're not making no noise, then you like what's actually going on. You come in here for a feel-good moment. Get in the trenches. And the first thing you have to do, talk to the neighbor on the left and right side of y'all.
So again, we're not just being rhetorical. I mean, those of you who have business cards and whatnot, let's start right in here. I mean, many of us know each other, but there are a lot of us that don't know each other. So let's get to know each other, because that'll be a first step, excuse me, a first step towards network building. Also, let me say before I forget, where's the gentleman that has the petition for Noche Diaz? Okay, so we have a petition here. Sir, just come right to the mic and tell us what that petition is. Then we're going to come back to Suhail for further comment. Go.
Thank you, Imam. Many of you probably know, as Imam did, this is Noche Diaz, who's been a young leader in the fight against stop and frisk. He's a member of the neighborhood patrol. He's also a leader in the Revolutionary Club. And he is now being targeted by the whole system that people talked about so coherently here. And that one of the great strengths here is that people made these connections and nailed the system. And that's something we have to learn very deeply. And it was extraordinary to hear these stories continue to be outraged and hear people say that these are all connected and it's a part of the system. And that's what Noche has become a revolutionary. He's leading this battle. He has a slogan, fight the power and transform people for revolution. He is a revolutionary leader and now has been targeted. They've arrested him 5 times in 4 different boroughs with protests around the stop and frisk. They've now piled them together and want to put him away for 4 years for standing by people who are being illegitimately, illegally brutalized and arrested by the police. His trial starts Tuesday, April 23rd. We're going to have a big rally at the 100 Center Street. People are all too familiar with that fucking place, right? And we will be there, but we have these petitions. Several have got them. I'd like to say we got Reverend Phelps and Reverend Coleman today. So you're safe? No. No, we want everybody to sign up before they leave and take some and bring them Sunday or bring them to the trial 8:45 Tuesday morning. And I already want to thank this group. Thank this group for what you've
Concrete
done.
measure. Let's move on it.
Right.
Suhail?
Okay. I guess for me, I think, coming from Los Angeles and being involved in some of the things that are going on there with LAPD, Special Order 1.
Sorry, just a time check. We got 15 minutes.
Okay. Special Order 1 and 11 is, it comes out of this work that I'm doing and also some of the writing and research that I've been doing as well. And one of the things that I'm, kind of really been concerned about is, as we can tell by some of the really poignant stories that are being told up here is the way in which like a certain kind of language gets normalized, whether it be a language about crime and then therefore there's a criminal, or a language of terror and therefore there's a terrorist, right? And we understand that, for many of us, like, it's an understandable response to say, for example, well, we're not the terrorists, but those guys are. Not all Muslims are terrorists, right? Not all black folk are criminal, right? And it's an understandable response that people sometimes have to things that are happening, right? But I think that we have to understand the fundamental problem with that kind of a position. Because once we name something as crime or a criminal, once we name something as terror or a terrorist, it sanctions the state to then crack down on it, right? Once you name it and it gets accepted and normalized, the state then gets legitimacy in cracking down upon it, right? And we know, primarily from communities of color, that the state doesn't view us as individuals, right? So once you name something called terrorism, or you name something called crime that affects communities of color, because it doesn't treat us as individuals, then the whole group gets targeted. Regardless of whether we say we're not the terrorists, but there are the bad ones in our group, right? So the very thing that we think we're challenging, we end up reinvigorating by accepting the language of terrorism and crime. And that's a big problem. And you can see the poverty in the thinking, right? So for example, if a white person commits a particular act, and you hear Muslims say this, for example, like when the Gurdwara shootings went down in Wisconsin, oh, see, white people can be terrorists too, right? But when a white person commits a so-called act of terrorism, right? They're an exception to the rest of white folks. They're mentally ill. They're a deviant personality. The rest of white America is not, racially profiled. They're not stigmatized. They're not shook down and stop and frisks. So we see the poverty in that kind of a thinking when we normalize the idea of terrorism and when we normalize the idea of crime. And I think rhetorically also, because so much of this, especially from legal frameworks, are about language, right? The language is so important to defining what these supposed problems are, whether it's naming a criminal or naming a terrorist. And we have to be really aware of it. So instead of kind of like accepting and normalizing the idea of crime or normalizing the idea of terror, we have to reject that, I think. I think that's really important because, to get back to my point about what's happening in Los Angeles, Special Order 1 and Special Order 11 are these programs that the LAPD is using to further criminalize black and brown communities. And there's a broad base of grassroots organizations that we're a part of that are trying to stop the LAPD from doing this. Like, how many more measures do you need to criminalize black and brown youth? But they're using the language of terrorism and security in order to get public support for it. Right? What has happened is the mainstream Muslim organization in the city broke from the coalition and signed up with the LAPD. LAPD did their photo op, put out their press release, and said this Special Order 1 and 11, they're about national security and terrorism. We got this Muslim organization to sign on, and they got all the press. The LA Times came out with the article, and they went ahead and went forward with it because this Muslim organization decided that they were going to be ventriloquists for white supremacy.
By the way, what's the name of that organization?
They're a mainstream Muslim organization in Los Angeles, California.
I'll find out what it is and put them out there. Just a matter of public record.
It's a mainstream Muslim organization in Southern California, right? And they've, so as a result, what I'm saying is they've assumed the logic of terrorism. The good guys are here. We're the good guys. We're the good citizens. We're the honorary whites, And the other ones are the ones you need to be careful and watch out for, whether they're black and brown youth or the other Muslim so-called terrorists. So I think rhetorically, we have to be very aware of even how language is being used and be careful ourselves not to deploy that language as well.
Excellent. Let's go to the next question. By the way, it's the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Okay? This is Imam, Talib, Abdur-Rashid outing them. Okay, because we have the same problem here in New York City. And those of us who are rooted in struggle, we know about collaborators, we know about Uncle Toms, and just that we're in America now, and America has a multi-ethnic fabric, so we have Uncle Toms who are multi-ethnic. They don't just look one way or speak one way, they come in all kinds of shapes and forms. And we need to be able to call a shovel, a spade, a spade. Let's go to the next question. We're wrapping up now.
My question would be,
here you go.
Why do you think there were so many illusions in Barack Obama and groups like the Socialist, International
So many what?
Social illusions against, in Barack Obama?
Okay.
And I think that it's very clear we opposed that he was seen as a lesser evil compared to Bush, when what we need is a workers' party that fights for revolution, that is independent from the bourgeoisie.
All right. Andy, you want to respond?
Yeah, regardless of any of our political affiliations, if we're going to win on this thing, we're going to need to be able to at least put some of our political affiliations at the door and just work together on issues of justice. Okay? Now, the underlying and the undercurrent of most of this is that capitalism begets industrial complexes, whether it be the military-industrial complex or the prison-industrial complex or the way that sweeps happen on the street to people of color and poor people when it comes to stop and frisk or drug sweeps, etc. I didn't want to have to do this, but I wanted to tell a story, and the story has to do with a man that I met while I was at the Communications Management Unit in Marion, Illinois. I am a white terrorist. I came from middle to upper class background. I probably got my mentality because I had a next door neighbor who was a police officer who abused me when I was younger. I usually don't ever talk about this. I'm not keen on talking about it afterwards. But it made me a vengeful and kind of angry young person. My mother was a hippie. I got turned on to activism. Instead of going the route of being a peacenik, I got a little bit more heavy-handed with my tactics by the time I became a teenager. Unlike the rest of the men that were at the CMU, I had a criminal mindset. Those men that were there that were Muslim had no criminal mindset. There was a man by the name of Abu Sayyaf, and every day he'd stare at a picture of his son named Sayyaf, and he would tell me that his legal name is Adim Emin Hassoun, and he never wanted to be called that anymore. He wanted to be called Abu Sayyaf, which means the father of Sayyaf in Arabic. And he told me that they could take everything away from him. They could put him in solitary confinement. They could take his phone away, his letters, everything else, but they can't take away the love of his son. And he would sit there sometimes for hours on end and cry and look at the picture of his son. And that's what I have burnt into my memory of the Communications Management Unit. And that's why I'm involved with things like this today. That's why I want to advocate for Noor and her family. That's why I want to advocate for Mrs. Parveen. It's because I saw these men, and out of this group of men, some of them are serving life or life plus 365 years. I was the one that only did 6.5 months through the system as a quote-unquote balancer, and I had the criminal mindset in the bunch. Abu Sayyaf, a few days before I left, pled with me to shed my criminal mindset like the layers of an onion before I go home. Because if I was used to the criminal or institutional mindset that I had, because I did 3.5 years in prison before I went to the CMU, and I was used to fighting and stabbings and things like that happen on the yards. He said to me that if I kept that criminal mindset, it was only a matter of time before I'd recidivate and end up back in prison, and I owe it to my family and to my loved ones never to do that. He also told me never to do something like I'm doing today. Don't talk about the CMU because my life is too important, and the way that they're treating the war on Islam, I can't be roped up into that. That's the one thing that I disobeyed when it came to what Abu Sayyaf asked of me. And the reason why I disobeyed is because when I left the CMU that day, I realized I left because I was white. And 76% of the men that are there are Muslim or Arab nationals. And most of the people that were there didn't know how to assert their rights, and post 9/11 were so scared of the prospects of being caught up in this war on terror that they took plea bargains. So there's nothing really to appeal. They were terrified of just the word terrorism or the fact they had family members back in Lebanon or another foreign country that might have known the wrong person or spoke to the wrong person on the phone at the time. Out of those 76% of the men that were there, most of them were designated as minimum or low security inmates because what they had were nonviolent offenses underneath the material support to terrorism statute. And underneath that terrorism statute, they can then enhance their sentencing guidelines to give them sometimes life in prison. So now you have life in prison on nonviolent offenses. And this is echoes of some of the crack laws. This is echoes of the Rockefeller drug laws where they take a dumb little rock. Yes, that rock ruins lives. Yes, that rock destroys communities. But they're taking young people who have that rock in their pocket and they're serving 25 years. Serving life, it's their second or third offense. These sentencing enhancements need to change. And I wanted to point out in the back of the room, there's a woman, I don't mean to out you, Sally Eberhardt, and she's been working tirelessly on trying to round up all of us together and get us to at least pool our talents, whether it be PR or activism. And we regularly have meetings. Amnesty International lends their office to us so we could use their office in Midtown. I invite you to join Sally and other people in getting involved and start advocating for these families and at least maybe reduce their sentences or bring them home sooner and change the mindset. I was that quote-unquote terrorist. These men were the ones that were constantly in the paper being labeled as such, and I never felt that while I was there.
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Andy. So we're going to end as we began by asking Lee to come up.
All the different faces of an incredibly oppressive, racist system. So thank you for your courage and your struggles. And thanks again, everyone, for coming out. And let's, I think this has really set us up to move our struggle forward.